Hey everybody, how's it going tonight? Thought I'd go ahead and drop another video. Before we get started though, I did want to just make a quick announcement for anybody that didn't catch it. Monroe Doctrine Volume 5, that's my second collaboration with author James Razone. That dropped on Friday, and so it's available now, and I'll leave a link in the description so you can click on that and join in on the fun there. For those that haven't been following that story, it essentially encompasses a global war in 2024, actually it's 2023, 2024, where China essentially takes on the world. And it's a pretty good read, if I do say so myself. I was enjoying the series even before I was writing it. And I was very fortunate that James let me jump on the team and get some experience writing in that story. So remember, Monroe Doctrine Volume 5. It's available on Amazon right now in Kindle, and in the future it's going to drop as a paperback. So I'll make sure I mention that when that happens. Other news, we have I just want to talk about one thing in Ukraine, and how could I not? And that is the sinking of the Moskva. This was the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, as I think anybody watching the news already knows. And this is a development that I've been waiting for basically since the war started. And that development was the use of the Jupiter surface-to-surface missiles. These are essentially Ukrainian-built versions of the Russian version of the Harpoon missile. Now that's an exaggeration. It's clearly not a direct copy. But functionally it has about the same specifications, give or take. I know the warhead is slightly smaller. I'm sure that performance is going to be a little bit different. But if you're familiar with the Harpoon, you'll be familiar with the Neptune. And so this was a weapon system that the Ukrainians have been developing for a while now, and there were some misleading reports or confusing reports from the very beginning of the war as to whether or not they actually had these fielded. In fact, if you're on James Razone's Facebook group, Ted Manning and I had a pretty long conversation about this, and I think that the conclusions ultimately that we came to, and this was mostly at Ted's insistence because he was very, very persuasive, the missiles that had been deployed were actually just a training unit, and we don't believe now that they had any operational Neptune missiles until very recently. And that would explain why, even though Russian warships had come within even visual range of Ukraine, they hadn't been engaged by this weapon system. But with that said, even having an effective surface-to-surface missile, an anti-ship cruise missile, it does make you wonder, what was the situation? How did this really play out? And I really do hope that we at some point get some details on that. So, for example, what were the emissions conditions of the Russian fleet during the attack? Did they have their radars on? It seems that they probably wouldn't. One, as soon as you turn on your radar, everybody knows where you are. And if you're operating in an area of sea and air dominance, then maybe that doesn't matter too much. But given what we've seen about the contested skies over Ukraine, I would think that the air threat would be enough to keep you wanting to keep a low profile and not radiate your radars until you felt you were engaged. Okay, so, and one thing to keep in mind is that, Moskva had essentially an S-300 air defense system on board that ship. That ship was, partially designed around that equipment. And while it's true, it's been supplanted by more modern systems, the S-300 is still capable. In fact, that's the best that the Ukrainians have. So it's certainly not an undefended or undefendable ship. So that makes you wonder, okay, if they weren't radiating, then how did the Ukrainians find them? And I think that has got to be an interesting question. And so I really do want to see more information come out about that, but I'm guessing it won't be for years until we hear anything else. Very surprised that the first ship sunk by the Ukrainians was the flagship, one of those old Slava cruisers from the Soviet Union. It blows my mind. I assumed that they would pick off a patrol boat. I thought maybe they might get one of the amphibs if they got too close. And I know they hit that alligator in port in Sevastopol. So this isn't the first ship they've gone after, but it's a pretty big deal. Not since the Falklands War has a ship of this size gone down, and this is even more impressive than that because, as I said, it had a decent air defense system on it. So that's really all I wanted to talk about on the Ukraine front. But now I want to shift from talking about the current real honest-to-goodness World War III that we're starting to go through, or I should say the potential World War III, and shift over to the World War III that I grew up with. For those that don't know, that's the poster, a little modified by me, of the movie The Day After. The Day After was a movie that really, really got me in, I was 10 years old when this movie came out, and we watched it as a family, and my father was a flight engineer for the C-130s that at the time were the backbone of the TACAMO operation. And for those that don't know, TACAMO stood for, or still stands for, Take Charge and Move Out. And what these aircraft would do is they would fly in lazy circles in the sky, waiting for the airborne command post to transmit orders to the nuclear submarines, to the ballistic missile submarines, the boomers, that were deep underwater. And in order to penetrate the water and get the message to the boomers, they would use very low frequency. Okay, that's great. Well, what does that mean? And what makes these aircraft special? Well, they would have a drogue basically pull an antenna out the back that would just extend forever and ever and ever, and then fly in tight circles so that just dangled down, and that length of that antenna could now be used to transmit these VLF frequencies. Without that length of antenna, they couldn't send those signals, and they wouldn't be able to actually reach the submarines. So I grew up in a family that was very attuned to the possibility of nuclear war, and so this TV show gave us something that we could look at and process and talk through, and so that's really what we did. And the 10-year-old Alex was, shaken by this, as you might imagine. If you haven't seen this movie, it is a little dated, but I think a lot of it still holds up, but that could be nostalgia. So your mileage may vary. You can find it on YouTube. I don't think it's actually streaming anywhere else at this point. And I got to admit, I actually watch this movie every couple of years to just kind of remind myself of what it was like to watch it the first time, and to remember what we really were staring down in the 80s. And and from the 60s on, as soon as the first ballistic missiles were created, this definitely was at least in the back of everybody's mind. And I find it interesting that even today, I feel like we are closer now than we ever were, except for perhaps maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis. I know that there's the Able Archer 83 was a pretty close call, but we didn't know about that. The public didn't know, and so it wasn't until after the fact that we realized how close we got. So as far as the public understanding of the dangers of nuclear war, I really feel like we're definitely as close as we've ever been. And sometimes I wonder if people are treating it as seriously as all that. But anyhow, just to kind of talk about the Day After, and I thought, actually, I've grown up with apocalyptic movies, and in fact, years before the Day After, I actually saw my first real post-apocalyptic movie or apocalyptic movie, and that was Charlton Heston's The Omega Man. This was playing one Saturday morning on the Far East Network when I was a little kid living in the Philippines. So you figure I'm in like second or third grade, and I'm watching Heston, machine gun down these weird disco vampire things. I loved that movie so hard. And I still do. Again, it's one of those movies, I can watch this movie at any time. I love it so much. So I just thought, I really dig these movies. I'm currently working on a series that is a Third World War that starts in 1980. Going and talking about these movies and looking at them, I almost consider it research for what I'm working on. So hopefully you guys will find this interesting. Let me know in the comments, or tell me to shut up and go back to talking about Ukraine. Tell me to shut the channel down and call it a day. I know I've got some fans and I've got some anti-fans out there. So I take what do I care? I'll listen to y'all. But I thought that I would talk about the day after. Maybe give it a rundown, talk a little bit about sort of common themes that we see in these World War III movies. The geopolitical situation that starts off the world, or starts off the film. Then talk a little bit about the war in narrative. So how are they explaining the war? How do they progress through the escalation that ultimately leads to World War III? Then talk about the war in visual effects. I think this is really fun because, this was not just 1983, but this was 1983 on television. So that's a little crazy to think about how far we've come. Netflix right now could do 800 times better than anything that they could do in the 80s. But with practical effects and with a little creativity and imagination, we'll see what they came up with. And then there's the aftermath. What happens after the war itself. Most of these movies, not all, will get into the aftermath. And then the last thing that I really want to talk about are the tropes. The tropes make these movies, if you ask me. Some of them are so cheesy, but they're always there, and it's like the filmmakers knew they had to put it in there because people were expecting it. So that's kind of the format that I'd like to take, and we can tweak this as we go if we decide that maybe some of this never happens or it's not that interesting. We'll see. But in this case, with the day after, let's start with the geopolitical situation. So the day after does not take long to get from a geopolitical situation to it's a war. In fact, the only real comment on the geopolitical situation is that the Soviets have decided to blockade Berlin. Now, if you're reading my books, you probably know that Berlin in the Cold War was smack dab in the middle of East Germany. So if you look at this map, the light green island that's surrounded by dark green, that's all that's Berlin. In fact, that's West Berlin, and then everything around it is East Germany. So Berlin, being behind or deep in East Germany, had a section of it that was controlled by the West, and that was West Berlin. But the Russians, the Soviets at the time, they really wanted control of all of Berlin, and just geographically, why not? Obviously, politically, it's charged, and this all comes from the fallout of the Second World War, when French, British, American, and Soviet forces occupied all of Germany, and then occupied all of Berlin, and the Soviets basically kept theirs, whereas France, England, and the United States returned theirs to what became West Germany. So this creates a situation where there's a population in Berlin that could easily be cut off by Soviet forces. In fact, in 1948, they did exactly that. They blockaded the city, and the only way that the West was able to survive was through what we called the Berlin Airlift, where we essentially overflew East German airspace so that we could drop supplies into West Berlin. So this was not unheard of, and this was definitely one of the possible trigger points for a NATO versus Warsaw Pact clash. But that was it. Once that was done, the Americans decided that, or I should say NATO, decided that was unacceptable, and so they went ahead and invaded into East Germany with the intention of relieving their forces in West Berlin. So all the forces, the French, the Germans, the Americans, we all had military forces. We had civilian populations that were in West Berlin. And so in order to relieve them, to get them, out of West Berlin, the NATO crossed into East Germany and with essentially an armored thrust, they crossed the Helmstedt, Marienborn, and man, I probably butchered that, border crossing, which is essentially the most direct route from West Germany to East Berlin. So that's not good. That's basically the beginning of World War III. That is, in today's parlance, that's Russia invading Poland. That basically is the trigger point. So we don't get a lot of updates about the day-to-day because most of this movie is still getting us introduced to the characters. You'll find with a lot of these World War II or World War III movies, I'm not going to spend too much time on the characters. They're mostly all walking tropes. It's not always the case, but these are definitely plot-driven films. But we did get a kind of a goofy scene where there's a newscaster in the background who's talking about how in the early part of the war, a Soviet MiG-25 flies into West German airspace and attacks supplies on West German soil. So they hit a depot on West German soil, and that's goofy because the MiG-25 never had any kind of air-to-ground capability. They were strictly interceptors and reconnaissance planes. So obviously the powers that be making the movie knew that nobody, not too many people watching the movie were going to really care about that, but it's the kind of thing that really stands out to a nerd like me. Okay, so the next step, the Russians evacuate Moscow. So we got the armored thrust comes in to East Germany. There's some skirmishing going along the east-west border. Then the next thing you know, the Russians evacuate Moscow. And this is meant to kind of show that escalation. Okay, the Russians are seriously thinking about this thing going, chain reaction, out of control, everybody dies. But I do think it's kind of funny because the one city that might not evacuate during a nuclear war like this might be Moscow. At the time, Moscow was the only city in the world that was actively protected by an anti-ballistic missile system. Now, I wouldn't put too much faith in its ability to actually thwart a nuclear attack, but that, I believe the NATO codename was Galash. That system would basically fire nuclear warheads into the atmosphere to detonate the incoming warheads before they could actually get close enough to cause significant and superior harm. In fact, the United States had a similar system that was based, I think, on the Nike Ajax platform. But by the time 1983 rolled around, we had basically abandoned the concept. So there is that. So okay, they evacuate Moscow, and the next thing that happens is what every one of us kids, Cold War kids, knew was going to come, and that is the Soviets come pouring through the Fulda Gap. For anybody that doesn't know, we figured, the strategists understood that just based on the geography of Germany, there were going to be two main armored thrusts coming from the Soviet territory, the Eastern Bloc, into NATO territory, and one would be the North German plains, and that would be met by the Northern Army Group, which was made up of the British, the Netherlands, the Germans, and I believe the French were up there. And then the other attack would come through what was known as the Fulda Gap, because it was literally the best place to conduct armored operations. It was the best terrain for it. And so even if you were completely giving up surprise, the tactical advantages of just being able to move quickly more than offset the lack of relevant surprise. So that was the next escalation, and then things get a little foggy. There's this interesting throwaway line in the background of a rumor that a low-yield nuke has been detonated just outside of Frankfurt. And we're talking like 2 days into the war. And one, it's interesting because they never really follow up on this. And so, fog of war, are they just letting us know that nobody knows what's going on? Because we're talking about, this is like 2 days into the war, and even the most optimistic plans that the Soviets had, still called for a week to get, to the Rhine, 7 days to the Rhine, they called it. And so that was interesting to me because, again, did the writers just throw that out there, or was that intentional? Hard to say. But it doesn't lead to anything. So it makes me believe that it's just this, fog of war, unconfirmed report, didn't really happen. We were getting some of that in the Ukraine conflict, because there would be these massive explosions of like a fuel or an ammo depot going off, and people were, starting to go, hey, wait a second, is that more than just a regular explosion? And no, it's not. But that's kind of how I can see a confused report like that coming out. The next escalation is another one that's kind of like the MiG-25 dropping bombs. It confuses me, and that is there's a naval engagement in the Persian Gulf, and that one kind of confuses me because I feel like there's not a lot of good reasons for the Soviets to be hanging out in the Persian Gulf at the time. Sure, it's possible, but it would just make more sense to me if this conflict had happened, in the North Sea or somewhere a little closer to the European conflict. And part of me thinks that they threw this one out there because essentially the Americans know where the Persian Gulf is. We had the Gulf War going on, not the Gulf War, but the tanker war going on. So it was in the news a lot. So I think that's probably why they did that, just to give us a little bit more of a grounding. So the next thing that happens after that is definitely what was called for in doctrine, and that was the NATO use of tactical nuclear weapons to stop the Soviet armored assault. So they essentially nuked them just as they came through, to stop them from getting to Frankfurt. And that's pretty much the end of the conventional war. Once the nukes start going off, it immediately escalates. The first thing that happens is the Russians nuke the NATO headquarters in Brussels. So gone. Okay. And then we get reports, and these crop up a lot in these movies. Beale Air Force Base gets wiped out, and that's important because that's a radar tracking station to help us track incoming ballistic missiles. So that's going to definitely be one of the first things that gets taken out if they're going to do a mass attack. And sure enough, the next thing we know, it is the most iconic TV scene of the 80s. It was what that poster is. It's a woman. It's actually not just this one woman. It's many characters are just standing out there watching the open fields as the missiles are leaving the silos and going into the air. And that's when you know that it's it's gone. It's over. It cannot escalate anymore. Now that there's a little fibbing there because, yeah, it could have been a partial launch. And in fact, I think we'll see, when we get to the aftermath that clearly this wasn't a complete and total annihilation. But no, that really gets us to the end of the war in narrative. After that, it's just, the detonations of the nuclear weapons, and then, we're moving on into the aftermath. So the war in visual effects, I think that this still holds up, but like I said at the beginning, it could just be me being nostalgic. They did a really good job with the airburst. So when they do an airburst over Kansas City, and they start with a scene of the skyline framed pretty well in the camera. but then it pans out, and you're like, oh, okay, well, it's a little further away from the city. And then it pans out again, and you're like, oh, okay, well, they're a little further away from the city. You know, the city is now getting smaller. And then they pan out again, and then you can see the flash of the airburst above it, and it just gives you this awesome understanding of, oh my God, that was huge. And I think that camera work where they're just that jarring, move, that absolutely makes it so much more significant, so much more impactful. Next, you have a ton of B-roll. Every time there was a major blast wave test that was available in the National Archives, I think, they dusted it off and put it in here. You'll see some of your old favorites. You'll see farmhouses collapsing, warehouses, being blown over. And hey, 1983 TV movie, I get it. I absolutely get it. But the one that got us 10-year-olds talking was this effect where you would get the flash and then it would essentially X-ray the people. So you would see their bones and then gone and vaporized. And that was it just drove the point home. It was really drawing up that fear of radiation, that, what are we really dealing with? My God, what is this going to mean, when this is all said and done? And so, again, I think with what they had to work with, I think they did a great job. And I still think it holds up, but I'd ask maybe some of the millennials or Gen Z to tell me I'm just being an old man. But no, that was the war in visual effects. The next thing we have is the aftermath, and it's brutal. It is as brutal as you would expect it to be. I know my British friends are all thinking about the movie Threads, and maybe we'll talk about that in a future video. But the land is absolutely destroyed. We have Billy McCoy is an airman who was maintenance on one of the missile silos, and we see the post explosion, post devastation world through his eyes largely, because he didn't have shelter. He wasn't protected anywhere, and so he's basically on foot trying to get back to his family. They're dead. Trying to find a place to go, find a place to be. And so yeah, you get a lot of ashing, floating around in the sky, darkness because of all that debris in the air, and that this was a time when nuclear winter was really being bandied about as a major cost of a nuclear exchange. And so I feel like even though nuclear winter is more of a bigger picture issue, I felt like they were kind of trying to allude to that with some of the way they shot the post-explosion, the post-detonation world. Where there was optimism in this film was the survivors, and there were quite a few survivors, but they were basically trying to put a government back together again in the aftermath. And so there were scenes where and remember, okay, actually, since we didn't really talk about the characters, one of the characters is a farming community. It's a farmer, his two daughters, and his wife. And after the war, after the exchange, after they crawl out of their shelters and dust themselves off, they're meeting up with the other farmers, and there's one poor guy who was the federal government's agent in the area who's trying to explain to everybody that, okay, so in order to grow crops, and we need to grow crops now, we need to scrape away the top 6 inches of your topsoil. It's like, okay, what are you going to do with that? You're going to have 6 inches of dirt. How many acres of farmland do I have? And what's under that 6 inches isn't exactly good for growing a lot. So, but they're giving it a shot. They're trying to make it happen. We don't. we don't go on very far to see what happens, you know, down the road. And again, I'll defer to my British friends and their film Threads, which does extend. It just keeps going, man. That is like the longest fingernail down the chalkboard, you know, end of a movie. Don't get me wrong, I love it, but it is a painful watch, and we were spared that in the day after. Though they do actually say in the end, they're like, oh, hey, by the way, also, this is very optimistic. If there's really a nuclear exchange, it's going to be way worse. So very sobering ending to that movie. But not to get too serious, we've got to roll back and we've got to talk about the tropes. All right. I talked about Billy McCoy. And he, again, he's an airman. He does maintenance on the missile base. So as this scene is unfolding, the Germans the Soviets are occupying or blockading Germany. Sorry, the Soviets are blockading West Berlin. The missile base goes on alert, and Airman McCoy has to go to the alert, and his wife is giving him so much static about the fact that he has to go on this alert. And yet, you know, they've had this conversation 100 times. I can't help it. I got to go. And yeah, that shows up in so many of these movies. Another one that I really liked was a gratuitous football scene. So one of the characters is a doctor in Lawrence, Kansas, over at the University of Kansas. And there is a scene where, for literally no reason but America, he stops by his son's football practice to watch him catch a few passes and talk to a fellow who's the father of one of the other players. And it's never mentioned before. It's never foreshadowed at all. It's never talked about again. It was just a reminder that this is America and you know, solid America too. You know, not that elitist coastal stuff. No, this is God-fearing the Midwest. So, panic buying at the grocery store. I think they did a really good job on that scene. You know, as soon as everybody realizes that they need 2 weeks worth of food, they're all going to try and get it at the same time. I mean, we lived it with the with the great toilet paper shortage of 2020. You know, we know what panic buying looks like, but that wasn't even for survival like this. So that's pretty that's pretty good. Okay. The next one is Mrs. Dahlberg. The Dahlbergs are the farmers, and so this is the farmer's wife. The world is falling apart around her, but she has a wedding the next day. Her daughter, one of her eldest daughter, is getting married, and so she just doesn't have time for nuclear war. She has dinner for 70 people coming up tomorrow, and there is just no way that she has time to take shelter. And so she has to basically be carried down the stairs, you know, fighting it the whole way. And again, you know, it's very common in these movies, the amount of denial. And I sometimes wonder about that. You know, would people really fight the reality of it? And, you know, the more I think about it, yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that there are definitely people that, for something like this, it just couldn't be real, or they couldn't let it be real. So I think that's definitely a fascinating aspect of these movies. And then the last trope is the Denise Dahlberg, the girl that was getting married. After maybe a week in the shelter, she just gets cabin fever and loses it and runs out. And she gets rescued is kind of the wrong word, but she is brought back into the shelter by everybody's favorite actor, Steve Guttenberg. This was one of his early roles. I think this was before he was Carrie Mahoney in Police Academy, for which he probably should have gotten an Academy Award. But this was I think my first exposure to Steve Guttenberg. But yeah, I think that cabin fever in these situations has absolutely got to be real. You know, how can you go from having your normal life to life is now confined within this storm cellar for 2 weeks without having some kind of real mental challenges, and somebody's going to succumb to that. So hopefully it's not you. Hopefully it's not your family. Hopefully we're not taking cover in fallout shelters anytime soon. Let's see. So the only other thing I want to talk about, a couple of lines they had in the movie that were pretty good, and these kind of stood out because they do remind me a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine today. And the first one was a talking head on the news is saying that the United States won't sacrifice Chicago for Hamburg. Basically, the idea was, even if the Russians invade, we're not gonna nuke the Russians because we're not gonna sacrifice any of our cities just to save Hamburg. And that gets bandied about a bit in today's situation, the idea that we're not going to exchange Chicago for Kyiv. And I think there's a real jump between the two, though, because in this case, Hamburg was, part of a NATO ally. And so we were, treaty obligated to defend Hamburg. And what does that mean as far as the use of nuclear weapons? That is kind of up in the air. But the difference is we just don't have that kind of commitment to Kyiv, and I know a lot of people get mad at me when I point that out, and they say, well, where's the line? And I always say the line is NATO, and that's always been the line, and as long as we make sure that everybody understands that that's the line, then we shouldn't have to be talking about an exchange like that. Another one was when one of the girls in the University of Kansas was in a debate, and she didn't think that it was going to go down. She didn't think that the fight was going to happen because she said, quote, "Look, did we help the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Afghans, or the Poles? We're not going to nuke the Russians to save the Germans." And again, it gets to that point that, well, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Afghanistan, and Poland, none of those were NATO countries. And so it's this fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be in a defensive alliance like that, and that literally is the advantage. So all in all, I really love this movie. It's a big slice of Americana. It's a big part of my childhood, and I hope you guys, if you haven't seen this film, I've ruined it for you completely. You probably don't have to see it, but you should still do yourself a favor and watch it. If you have seen it and you liked it, hey, I recommend look it up on YouTube. Give it a watch again, and let me know if you think it holds up. And with all that said, if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. I'm having a lot of fun. I'm learning a lot of this video production stuff, and so I hope you stick around. And I'll chat at you hopefully next Tuesday. Thanks a lot.